Welcome to Guest Room. Today we have with us Professor Lambert of Stellenbosch University. He specialized into management and supervision of social workers. Let us welcome him. Welcome, Doctor. Could you please tell us something about yourself?
I was born in the west coast of South Africa, and then I completed my postgraduate studies at Stellenbosch University, which is the most southern university in South Africa. And I'm teaching there for the past decade and a half in the Department of Social Work, where I specialize then, as you said, in the management and supervision of social workers.
So you are a professor, as I understand.
That's right.
So what do you teach?
I'm teaching specifically undergraduate students the basics of social work administration. Then like fourth year students would be on an honours level in South Africa, supervision and management, how to supervise other social workers, how to manage an organisation, because social work is not just on intervention, it is not just focusing on pathology. These interventions should also be managed, and that is where my interest is. And then, of course, I'm teaching on postgraduate level. I have a couple of master's students and PhD students, also working in the fields, various areas of management and supervision. That can vary from mindfulness to what social workers actually doing and actually have to manage in practice. And an area that is of specific interest of me is a strengths perspective on social work.
Professor, what is your research topic all about?
My research topics are obviously focused on supervision and management, but I also combine it with other areas within a social development paradigm. With a social development paradigm, I mean, how do you integrate economic development and human development? This is specifically applicable to the South African context, where there's a high level of poverty and a huge gap between the rich and the poor. So that is actually my context. So I'm researching the context, but also then how to manage and supervise social workers within that specific context. So that is keeping me quite busy, because I'm focusing more on qualitative research, in other words, going into the field and hear the stories, the voices of the social workers. Because social workers are usually working with clients or service users, absorbing what they're hearing in practice and absorbing what they're seeing and doing in practice. But nobody really takes care of the social workers themselves. And that is what I'm actually researching then. How to take care of social workers, how to support social workers in terms of their self-preservation, what is keeping them going. And this is where I'm coming in.
Are you trying to say that you motivate them and you basically manage all their works? And
yes, it is to motivate them, and because management in social work, there are distinct differences between management of social welfare, social work per se, and a business. Because in a business, management would be how to make more profit, how to make more money. But in social work, it's not about money. It's about human capital. So it would be hard to capitalize on the human capital, and that human capital is the social workers, how to empower also social workers. So in order for social workers to empower service users, social workers should be empowered as well. And this is where I'm coming in. Unfortunately, it's not a field that many people are focusing in, because when you hear social work, you're thinking of going into the field, working with people in need. But people forget that the practitioners also need
help.
Yeah, this is what my field of interest is in.
If you could just a little bit more elaborate and explain what it includes.
It includes more to do it in a scientific level, not to just say, I will support you, or You can ventilate about what did you experience today. It is to do it in a scientific way, in terms of to sort of educate the social worker as well, how to do this self-preservation, how to, in order to relate to specific client types of service users, but also to support and help the social worker absorb these stresses. So it's also to serve as a soundboard, but not in a usual friendship way, but in a professional capacity.
Right.
And therefore, I'm focusing specifically on specific models and perspectives. And my perspective is building on the social worker's strengths. Because in South Africa, we're trying to work in the paradigm of a strengths perspective, where we say we don't just want to focus on the deficits of service users, but if you're focusing on the strengths of service users, you should also focus on the strengths of the social worker, because you can't, otherwise there will be a disillusion if you're focusing on the deficits of the social worker or what they don't do right in intervention, and then they in turn have to focus on the strengths of the service user. So in order to empower, we say, no, we're focusing on the strengths of the social worker. And you asked me in particular the outcomes of my research. I just completed a research study where I analyzed 120 qualitative narratives of social workers to establish what do they receive as their signature strengths. And that was quite interesting to cluster the narratives in terms of themes to identify, but what do they perceive are the strengths of social workers. And one of the strengths is, for instance, that they feel they are competent, that they possess leadership potential, that they are empathic, that they can connect with people. So this is the type of strengths that we're focusing, something like resilience, for instance, that they can give hope, that they have hope for themselves, that they can be enthusiastic, that they are energetic. So that is the type of concrete characteristics or attributes that we are focusing on and try to capitalize on the helper, not just the service user.
So, Doctor, what do you think are the challenges that are faced by the social workers themselves when they meet the service users?
Oh, there's a lot of challenges, and that is in particular what I tried to contain in my research as well. One of the challenges is, in particular, in the South African situation, but also I think in India and many other parts of the world, is the poverty. And with poverty goes along many other problems. So what I'm focusing on is when the social worker is getting to the office, what do they do in their work? How does what is happening in the work from minute to minute? And if you relive that, I mean, that can be so traumatic and what we call secondary trauma that the social worker can experience. But then the social worker gets back to the office and there's a lack of facilities. So that in itself can also contribute to trauma. Specifically within a mental health context, for instance, when the social worker is in the office and somebody's phoning and say, on 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at maybe a Friday afternoon, can you please help me? I'm sitting here with my mentally ill son and he's getting violent. The police doesn't want to help me. They said, go to the social worker. What should the social worker do at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon? Because the social worker is usually the last resort that people are going to. And there is no facilities. Because all over the world, I think social work NGOs other welfare agencies are not getting the rightful funding that they should get, because social work sometimes is getting a political play ball for governments. Coming election time, then everybody becomes a social worker. After the election times, all that is left is the promises. And it is a social worker at a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, when everybody's closing their doors for a weekend, that is stuck with the client that needs help then. So I think that can be really traumatic, because social workers study social work to help.
To help.
They don't study social work for the money. And when you can't help, I think it can get very traumatic for you. But there are also other secondary challenges. For instance, generation gaps, because you'll get older social workers that are in management positions, a new social worker is coming in, new social worker that you can define as within as a digital, what you call that, digital native, close to a digital maniac if you look at some of the youngsters, but still, and all the social workers don't work with computers, for instance. So you might have also a lot of conflict in the work. So that is also that I'm investigating. Also cultural differences between the manager or the supervisor and the supervisee. You've got a lot of authority problems, class problems, for instance. So these are the type of things that nobody really talks about, because they're thinking if you're a social worker, you're a good person, but you're still a human being. You still have the same feelings, and that is what I'm trying to focus on in my research.
So do you think there is any limitations to the research topic?
Oh yes, I think the biggest limitation is there's not too many researchers interested in the topic specifically of supervision and management. There's a lot of researchers working in management, but not particular social work organizations. I think one of the limitations or one of the challenges, if you change the limitation to a challenge, is that I have to create grounded theory for my work, and that is why I'm focusing specifically on qualitative research, where I want to hear the voices of the people in practice. But working within a strengths paradigm, I changed that, or I took up this challenge and brought out a couple of publications, trying to publish as much as journal articles as possible, and I just recently edited a book specifically on supervision and management of social workers within a social development context. The reason behind that was that in countries like South Africa, academics draw a lot on European context or North American context and trying to replicate it within our countries, not focusing on not creating indigenous literature. And that is what I tried to do with that book, and that is why I'm so focused on research, to create indigenous literature and indigenous theories for our work in social work. So I contracted other professors from other universities and bringing them all together within this publication.
Sir, how the government is working towards the cause?
Right. The South African government, I think, is currently acutely aware of the deficit in supervision and management, and our Department of Social Welfare, what we call the Department of Social Development, the national department, they started with the initiative, I think it was about 3 years ago, where I was involved in trying to compile a supervision framework that could be given to every social work organization in South Africa, and that, as I said, contained a framework for supervision of social workers. So at this moment, supervision of social workers is mandatory. In other words, if you're doing social work in South Africa, you can be guaranteed, although it's not working in practice like that as everything else, but it should be mandatory to have or to get supervision from a senior social worker in order to curb this problem of secondary trauma and to help with your support in order to do your work the best you can do.
So, can you please also tell our viewers how has it affected your life?
I think my whole notion of management is to try to unboss the manager.
Okay.
That sounds quite strange. To unboss the manager, not to work in this hierarchy, but to have a more horizontal way of working where the manager or the so-called boss will be the facilitator and rather facilitate and enhance the capacity of the worker or the employee. So working towards workplace wellness. So in my job, I think I'm a little bit of a workaholic, especially with my last publication. I would work until 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the mornings. And then all of a sudden I realized if I'm preaching other people to look after themselves, to preserve themselves, if I'm talking about workplace wellness, I should do the same in my life. On the other hand as well, what it also taught me was that where people just focusing by normal way of speech in terms of other people's constraints and deficits, I can't do the same. And in my personal life, my family life, it helped me so much just to try to see the strength in my kids, for instance, the strength in my family life, in my relationship with my wife, for instance. I've got a 17-year-old child, typical son. I've got my daughter is second year in university, studying law, or I hope she's studying law, normal kids, but trying to see the strength in our relationship, the strength in what they're doing, rather focusing on their competencies and not on what they cannot do. So my research, what I got from practice, taught me quite a lot and I think enriched me as an individual. And at the end, I think it emanates to a change in your vocabulary, because we are so used to talk about negative things, using negative language instead of a positive language, focusing on the beauty of things. So yeah, it's very easy to say I'm working within a strengths perspective, but you need to practice what you preach. And that is the effect, what it had in my life, that I needed to change my own vocabulary, the way, the lens I'm looking to the world.
Professor, do you have any message for our viewers?
Yes, of course. Maybe first, for people in the helping profession, I think it takes a specific individual to be a helper. Many people can work in a cafe. Of course, you need certain skills for that. Of course, you need certain skills to be an engineer. But I think in social work, where there's not a lot of money, but you need to put in a lot of intellectual capacity, many years of studying, I think these are special people that we need to take care of. It is very easy in specific contexts to have a lot of complaints about social workers. But on the other hand, they are also just human beings. So rather, I think societies should nurture social workers and should try to help them to empower service users as well. When you're giving maybe money to somebody that you think is in need, I think you should also think of this profession of social work that is also trying to help other people in need.
Thank you, Doctor, for your time and valuable inputs. We really had a pleasurable time.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to be your guest.
Until we meet next time, this is Chitira signing off.